Okay, in section 12.2, we're going to look at multiplication. There's actually two different types of multiplication that you're going to do. You're going to do what's called scalar multiplication, and then you're also going to have where you just actually multiply two matrices together. Now, scalar multiplication is super easy. That just simply means that you have a number times a matrix. So like in this case, I have 5 times this matrix. So anytime, again, it's just simply a number times a matrix. All that you have to do is just multiply all of your elements in here, all of your numbers, by this 5. This is what's referred to as your scalar. So your -1 times your 5 is -5. Of course, 0 times 5 is 0. -6 times 5 is -30. 11 times 5 is 55. -8 times 5 is -40. And 7 times 5 is 35. Okay, so it is that simple. That's all there is that you have to worry about when it's scalar multiplication. Now, doing a matrix times a matrix is a little bit more involved, and we actually need to talk a little bit more about the size of a matrix, okay? So as I have stated here, it says that the size of a matrix is always written as rows or rows by columns. Now, when you're talking about rows and columns, rows, like run left and right. That's kind of like the lines on your notebook paper. Columns are like columns on a house, run up and down, okay? So I've got some examples here of some matrices that we just need to determine what is the size of the matrix. Okay, so first of all, we need to identify how many rows. And like I said, rows are just like lines on the notebook paper. So if you were to copy this on your notebook paper, how many lines of notebook paper would it take? This would be considered your first row. So 1, 2, 3 would be row 1. 4, 5, 6 would be row 2. So this would have 2 rows. And columns run up and down like columns on a house. So the 1 and 4 would be your first column. The 2 and 5 would be in your second column. The 3 and the 6 would be in your third column. So that means you would have 3 columns. So the dimension would be a 2 by 3. Okay, this next one. Again, how many rows do you have? So this would be row 1, and this would be row 2. So we've got 2 rows, but this one also has 2 columns. So this one would be a 2 by 2. Okay, on this last one, on rows, remember rows are like lines of notebook paper, so you'd have to have 1 line of notebook paper to write the 1 down, and then you'd have to have another line of notebook paper to write the 2 down. So this is row 1, this is row 2. But on this one with columns, you only have just the 1 column, so the dimension of that one would be a 2 by 1. So to multiply, we're going to have to talk a little bit more detail about the size of the matrix, so that's kind of wanted to run through that. Now, to be able to do the multiplication, they don't have to be the same size, like with adding and subtracting, okay? So let me explain what I have down here. Okay, so what I have here, this m by n, this is representing the size of the first matrix. So let's call this matrix A. A lot of times they'll just use capital letters like this to represent a matrix. And this is going to be matrix B. Okay? So matrix A has a size of m by n. Matrix B has a size of n by p. Now you'll notice here I've used the same variable on, this would be your rows and this one would be your columns, okay? I've used the same variable because, as I've stated, those must be the same in order to multiply. So you're going to have to write down both dimensions, and it's going to be these two numbers here that have to be the same in order to be able to multiply, okay? The easiest way that I remember it, write down the dimensions of the first one first, write down the dimensions of the second one second, make sure you write it in the correct order, and it's the two numbers that are on the inside. Those are the two that have to be the same. Now, here I've used different variables. They can be the same, M and P can be, but they don't have to be. And as I've stated here, if you actually put these two numbers together, that's actually going to give you the size of your answer, like what would be the dimensions of your answer. That's not something that you really have to remember. You just have to remember to check these two, and those two have to be the same to be able to multiply. Okay, so here's our first one. So let's talk about, like I said, our dimensions first of all. So on this one, I would have 2 rows, and I would have 3 columns. Okay, then come to the second one. Now this one is going to have 3 rows, row 1, row 2, row 3, and it's going to have 2 columns. Okay, now it's this one and this one that have to be the same. Remember, it's the two dimensions on the inside that must be the same in order to multiply. So if these two numbers aren't the same, then you write down that it can't be multiplied and you're done with the problem, okay? All right, now listen carefully because this is going to take a lot more work than adding and subtracting does. You're going to go with your first row and your first column. So you always go with your row here, your column over here. So you notice I've got 3 going across and I've got 3 going down. So what you're going to do is multiply the numbers, like the first numbers you're going to multiply, the second numbers you're going to multiply, and the third number you're going to multiply. But then you have to add all of that together. Okay, so we're gonna have to write down some steps on this one. So you're going to do -5 times 6, and then put a plus sign, and then go to the second number, so that would be 0 times 8. Put a plus sign, and then you do the 2 times the 2. Okay, like I said, all of that, you got to do the multiplication, you got to do the adding, and that all ends up becoming just one number in your answer, okay? Now, I'm going to scoot over here to this next column. So this time, I'm still going to stay with this first row, what I have in yellow, but I'm going to scoot over and I'm going to do this next column that I've put in orange. And I'm going to do the same thing I just did here, but I've got to write it here. So just leave yourself a space, because what you've written here is not going to have anything to do with what you're fixing to write down. So leave a space. So take your first numbers. So -5 times -4 plus 0 times 1 plus 2 times 0. Okay, so I have used my first row with both columns. Okay, so now we're going to come back to this next row, and I'm going to do the same thing I just did, but I have to use this row with this column and then this row with this column. Okay, so now come down here. You got to make sure you put these two side by side. So now pink in blue. So 9 times 6 plus negative 3 times 8 plus 1 times 2. Okay? So now I've got to move over to this last column. So still the pink, but this time with the orange. And that's going to go here. Okay, so I've got the 9 times the negative 4 plus negative 3 times 1 plus 1 times 0. Okay, let's do the basic multiplication and addition here, and we'll have our answer. Okay, so this is, and of course you can just type this all in your calculator just like it is if you want to, but this is going to give us negative 30, and of course this would be plus 0, and this would be plus 4. So that's going to end up giving us negative 26. Okay, then here, negative 5 times negative 4, so that would be positive 20, plus 0, plus 0. You can use your calculator to help you out if you'd like. Okay, now here, I've got 54 plus, and that would be a negative 24, plus 2. So that's going to give me 32. And now last here, I would have negative 36 plus a negative 3. And of course that's plus 0, so that gives me negative 39. So this is your final answer.